The Last Letter. Somewhere in a box in a house in Japan, there is a letter written on the back of a JAL boarding pass. It was written by a man named Hirosugu Kawaguchi, a section manager at a cosmetics company. He was 52 years old. He was on his way home from a business trip to Tokyo, flying back to his family in Osaka on a Monday evening, the eve of the Obon holiday, one of the most important celebrations in the Japanese calendar. The plane was packed, every seat was taken. At some point in the 32 minutes between the moment something went catastrophically wrong with the aircraft and the moment it struck the ridge of Mount Takamagara, Mr. Kawaguchi took out his boarding pass and wrote to his family, "To Soiyoshi and Chizu, to my good children, be kind to one another and work hard. Hope your mother. It is 6:30 and the plane is diving steeply. I am not afraid to die. Do your best. Goodbye." He knew for 32 minutes the 524 people on Japan Airlines Flight 123 knew irreversibly wrong. They just didn't know why. Welcome back, everyone. For those of you who are new here, my name is Sammy. I'm a qualified pilot, and on this channel today we are looking at an aviation accident to understand what went wrong and, most importantly, what we can learn from them. Today we're going to find out how a repair made 7 years earlier, a repair that took just 2 hours and used the wrong number of rivets, killed 520 people on a warm August evening over the Japanese Alps. This is the deadliest single aircraft accident in aviation history. Let's get into it. Before we get to the disaster itself, we need to understand the machine and the specific variant that made this accident possible. 524 people aboard, with 520 fatalities. 32 minutes of flight, 7 years since the repair, 7 years since their faulty repair. JA8119, the reg of the aircraft, was a Boeing 747 short range. It was specially reinforced variant of the 747, designed specifically for the Japanese domestic market, where aircraft make many more takeoff and landings cycles per day than a typical long-haul 747. The fuselage and the structure were strengthened to handle the additional metal fatigue that comes with constant pressurization and depressurization cycles. Japan Airlines operated these aircraft on the Tokyo-Osaka route, one of the busiest air corridors in the world, and in 1985, the busiest single route, multiple flights per day, packed with salarymen, families, holidaymakers. The Obon holiday period, when the Japanese travel in enormous numbers to visit ancestors' graves, was the busiest time of the year. Flight 123 on August 12th was fully booked, every single seat. The key component you need to understand is the aft pressure bulkhead. This is a large dome-shaped metal partition at the very rear of the pressurized cabin, essentially a wall that holds back the pressure differential between the inside of the aircraft and the outside atmosphere. Every time the aircraft pressurizes and depressurizes, this bulkhead flexes slightly. Over thousands of cycles, that flexing causes metal fatigue. It is a known engineering challenge, and one Boeing had specifically designed for in the short-range variant. In June 1978, JA8119 had a tail strike incident at Osaka Airport. The tail of the aircraft scraped the runway on landing, a relatively common type of incident. Boeing engineers were sent to carry out the repair. And this is where the story of Flight 123 actually begins. 7 years before the crash. The tail strike had damaged the aft pressure bulkhead. It required to be repaired. Boeing sent a maintenance team to Japan, and they carried out the work, a procedure that involves splicing the damaged section of the bulkhead back together using a double plate reinforced with rows of rivets. The correct procedure, as specified in Boeing's maintenance manual, required a single splice plate connecting the two sections of the damaged bulkhead, riveted in 2 rows, sharing the load across the joint. What the Boeing maintenance team actually did was use 2 separate splice plates instead of one continuous one. This sounds minor, however it wasn't. The result was that the lower splice plate was only attached with a single row of rivets where there should have been 2. The load-bearing capacity of that joint was roughly half of what it should have been. The repaired bulkhead was certified as airworthy. It passed inspection. The aircraft returned to service. Over the next 7 years, it completed approximately 12,319 pressurization cycles, each one flexing the under-riveted splice just a little further towards failure. Investigators would later calculate that the faulty splice had been propagating a fatigue crack from the moment the repair was completed. By August 1985, that crack had grown until that bulkhead was on the edge of catastrophic failure. All it needed was one more pressurization cycle. On August 12, 1985, Flight 123 was that cycle. Flight 123 departs normally. 509 passengers and 15 crew on board. A routine 54-minute domestic hop to Osaka. At 23,900 feet, the aft pressure bulkhead fails catastrophically. The pressurized air from the cabin blasts into unpressurized tail section, destroying the vertical stabilizer and severing all 4 hydraulic lines. The tail fin is blown off the aircraft. This is total hydraulic failure. With all 4 hydraulic systems severed, the crew loses all conventional flight controls. Ailerons, rudder, elevator. The aircraft becomes almost entirely uncontrollable. 32 minutes of desperate struggle. Captain Masami Takahama and his crew attempt to control the aircraft using differential engine thrust alone, increasing or reducing power on the 4 engines to induce turns. The aircraft enters phugoid oscillation, a terrifying rhythmic pitching cycle. The crew fights it without instruments, without controls, in deteriorating conditions over mountainous terrain. The aircraft passes near Suruga Bay. At this moment, the crew may have had an opportunity to attempt a water landing. Whether this was seriously considered or not, or achievable given their control state, remains debated. The aircraft strikes the ridge at approximately 1,500 meters elevation in the Gunma Prefecture Mountains. The impact is devastating. Of 524 aboard, 520 die. 4 survivors are found the following morning. I want to dwell on those 32 minutes because they are at the heart of what makes this accident so haunting. The crew of Flight 123 knew almost immediately that something was catastrophically wrong. They declared an emergency within a minute of the bulkhead failure. They communicated with Tokyo ATC. They attempted everything in their training and beyond to keep that aircraft flying. There is, at that point, no checklist for complete hydraulic failure on a 747. There had never been one, because it was considered an essentially impossible scenario. The crew were improvising in the dark over mountains in an aircraft that was hunting and pitching in ways no aircraft should ever move. At one point, they almost made it to Nagoya Airport. They were close enough that the crew briefly discussed the approach, but the oscillations were too severe, the terrain too close, and the aircraft too difficult to control. They never made the runway. The last 32 minutes, cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were both recovered. What they captured was quite extraordinary and deeply moving. Let me walk you through some of the key moments. So, JAL 123 confirm nature of emergency. First officer, uncontrollable, repeated, the aircraft is in a fugoid oscillation, climbing and diving in slow, nauseating waves. Captain, flaps up, power, power. The crew at this moment is attempting to use engine thrust differentials to steer. It's working, but barely. Engine, hydraulic pressure, all 4 systems lost. The captain deploying speed brakes, landing gear, trying anything. First officer declaring mayday. Heading, we can't control heading. The captain, left turn, whilst the aircraft banking to the right instead, and the engine fights it. Terrain. The sound of the GPWS alert sounding. Mountains visible through the windscreen in the fading evening light. Captain again, full power. These were the final words on the cockpit voice recorder before impact. The captain's final call for full power was the right instinct. He was trying to climb, to pull up, to gain enough altitude to clear the ridge. He was 32 minutes into an impossible fight, and he was still fighting. He didn't make it. But what he and his crew achieved, keeping a 747 with no hydraulic controls in the air for 32 minutes, giving passengers time to write letters, time to put on life jackets, time to prepare, was nothing short of extraordinary airmanship. The crash site was in a remote mountainous terrain. The first reports came into the Japanese self-defense forces just before 7 p.m. and then nothing. Night fell over the Gunma Mountains. The terrain was steep, forested, inaccessible. Rescue operations were delayed. A JSDF helicopter crew spotted the crash site that night in the dark and reported their position. The information was passed through the chain of command. Rescue teams were not deployed until morning, a delay that remains deeply controversial in Japan to this day, and which investigators and journalists have long argued may have cost lives that did not need to be lost. When rescue teams finally reached the site the following morning, August the 13th, they found 520 dead. They also found 4 survivors. The 4 survivors of the JAL 123. Number 1, Yumi Ochiai, 26 years of age, an off-duty JAL flight attendant seated near the rear of the aircraft. She had been seated in row 54. She described hearing the explosion, passengers putting on life jackets, and crying. She lost consciousness before the impact and woke up on the hillside. Next, Kiku Kawakami, 12 years of age, was found in a tree still in her seat. She had been traveling with her parents and younger sister, who did not survive. Third, Mikuko Suji, 34 years of age, seated at the rear of the aircraft. She too retained fragments of her seat structure, which investigators believe absorbed some of the impact energy. Then you have Hiroki Yoshizaki, 8 years of age, the youngest survivor. He had been traveling with his mother and sister. He was found alone. All 4 were seated towards the rear of the aircraft. Yumi's testimony was critical to the investigation. She was aviation trained, conscious for much of the incident, and was able to provide detailed observation about the sequence of events in the cabin. Her account confirmed what the cockpit voice recorder had suggested. The passengers had time to know what was happening, to write notes, to hold each other. The letters and notes found on the victims included Mr. Kawaguchi's boarding pass messages were not panicked scrolls. They were careful, considered, and deliberate farewells. The Japan Transport Safety Board, together with Boeing and the NTSB, conducted the investigation. The wreckage was spread across the mountainside, but the key evidence was clear. The vertical stabilizer, the large tail fin, was found in the ocean, far from the crash site. It had separated from the aircraft during the initial decompression event. This told the investigators that the tail structure had failed before the crash, not during it. Examination of the aft pressure bulkhead wreckage revealed the critical details. The faulty splice plate from the 1978 repair. Under microscopic analysis, investigators found metal fatigue cracks originating at the rivet holes of the improperly installed splice, exactly where the missing row of rivets had left the joint, under strength for 7 years. Improper repair of the aft pressure bulkhead. 1978, Boeing maintenance personnel used 2 splice plates instead of 1, leaving the lower plate attached with a single row of rivets rather than 2. This was a direct violation of Boeing's maintenance manual. The repair passed inspection, but it shouldn't have. The metal fatigue over 12,319 pressurization cycles. The under-riveted joints propagated fatigue cracks over 7 years of service. No inspection procedure at the time was capable of detecting the developing crack in the location. The bulkhead was not flagged as a concern at any maintenance check. The catastrophic failure cascade. Bulkhead to stabilizer to hydraulics. When the bulkhead failed, the pressure wave destroyed the vertical stabilizer and severed all 4 independent hydraulic lines simultaneously, an event Boeing had considered essentially impossible to engineer. The aircraft's redundant hydraulic system design assumed no single failure could sever all 4 lines at once. The decompression event was that failure mode. No procedure for total hydraulic failure. Neither JAL training nor Boeing's operating manuals contained procedures for complete loss of all hydraulic systems. The crew were entirely without guidance. The fact that they kept the aircraft controllable for 32 minutes using differential engine thrusts alone is considered by many aviation engineers to represent extraordinary airmanship. The delayed rescue response JSDF helicopter's crew visually confirmed the crash site and reported it the night of the accident. Rescue teams, however, were not deployed until the following morning. The JTSB report did not formally address this issue, but it became a major focus of subsequent public and parliamentary scrutiny in Japan. Whether earlier rescue could have saved additional lives from among those initially injured but alive at the scene is unknown. But the question has never been satisfactorily answered. The aftermath of JAL 123 was unlike almost any other aviation accident because of the cultural response in Japan was unlike anything in the West. Boeing accepted responsibility for the faulty repair. The company paid compensation to victims' families. A senior Boeing maintenance quality manager involved with the 1978 repair reportedly took his own life in the months following the accident, a detail that speaks to the weight of responsibility felt individually and institutionally in Japan's cultural context. Susumu Dajima, the president of Japan Airlines, resigned. So did other senior JAL executives. The airline's head of flight operations visited the families of victims personally. 520 families. This was not a PR exercise. It was, in the Japanese tradition, an act of direct personal accountability. For JAL itself, the disaster triggered a decade of soul-searching about safety culture, maintenance standards, and the pressure of operating one of the world's most heavily used domestic air networks. The airline would face further financial and structural crisis in subsequent decades, eventually going bankrupt in 2010 before restructuring. Whether the shadow of Flight 123 contributed to those institutional difficulties is a question Japan has never fully stopped asking. In Japan, August 12 is not an abstract date on a calendar. Near the crash site, a memorial called the Osutaka, the Ridge of Osutaka, is visited every year. The families of the 520 who died there have never stopped returning. What JAL 123 changed. The legacy of Flight 123 runs through aviation engineering in ways that are not always visible, but present. Boeing's maintenance procedure for pressure bulkhead repairs are now completely revised. The specific repair method used in 1978 was eliminated. Inspection regimes for high cycle aircraft like the 747 short range significantly tightened. The concept of safe life limits for structural components, the number of cycles after which a component must be retired regardless of apparent condition, was revisited across the industry. The accident also drove research into hydraulic system redundancy and the concept of propulsion-only flight control, using engine thrust differentials to control an aircraft that has lost its hydraulic systems. The work done after JAL 123 directly informed the response by the crew of United Airlines Flight 232 in 1989, who used exactly this technique to partially control a DC-10 that had suffered a similar total hydraulic failure. That crew managed to reach an airport. They lost 111 of 296 aboard, a tragedy, but a very different outcome from JAL 123, and one that many aviation engineers believe was shaped by what was learned from the Japanese Alps in 1985. There is also a quieter legacy. The notes and letters found on the victims of Flight 123 were carefully collected, documented, and returned to families. Mr. Kawaguchi's boarding pass message to his children, to be kind to one another, to work hard, to help their mother. This was published with his family's permission. It has been reprinted, quoted, and remembered for 40 years. It is in its way the most important document in the history of aviation safety, not because of what it tells us about engineering, but because of what it tells us about why engineering matters. 520 people, a repair that took 2 hours, a missing row of rivets, 7 years of metal fatigue, 32 minutes of impossible airmanship over the Japanese Alps. Japan Airlines Flight 123 is not just the deadliest single aircraft accident in history. It is one of the most complete illustrations of how aviation disasters work and how a single maintenance error, undetected and uncorrected, can propagate silently through years of service until the moment it cannot be contained any longer. The people who died on that aircraft in August 1985, the salaryman who wrote to his children on a boarding pass, the families heading home for Obon, the crew who fought for 32 minutes with an aircraft that should not have been flyable. Their deaths changed aviation. The procedures that came from this accident are embedded in every high-cycle aircraft inspection program in the world today. That is not consolation, but it is truth. And in this field, truth is what we owe them. If you want to go deeper, the JT accident report is publicly available. And I strongly recommend the NHK documentary on Flight 123, which includes testimony from survivor Yumi Ochaye and from families of the victims. Subscribe if you haven't. I'll see you in the next one. Until then, blue skies, Sam is fly.